Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting us to be part of this workshop. Our sincere apologies for not being there in person. Travel issues just made it too much of a challenge. This presentation will be a double act, which is the best way to reflect the joint nature of the work. I'm Tara Hooper from Natural England, and you will also hear from my colleague Leonie Robinson from the MMO. And we're going to introduce you to our work developing a natural capital approach to the sustainability appraisal for marine plans. The thinking on how we could apply a natural capital approach to sustainability appraisal started back in 2018 within an academic partnership project called the Southwest Partnership for the Environment and Economic Prosperity, or SWEEP, that was supporting the MMO-led Marine Pioneer project. We were looking at how to start testing the natural capital approach in practice and focused on sustainability appraisal after talking to local and national stakeholders. Sustainability appraisal is a key tool in planning, but is also a sufficiently flexible framework to allow new approaches. For that first iteration, we tested it out at the local authority level as part of the North Devon Marine Natural Capital Plan. There was interest at the time in applying the approach to marine planning, but thinking wasn't quite advanced enough for a high-profile live policy situation. However, the upcoming refresh of the East Marine Plan has given us the perfect opportunity to apply the learning from the past few years in that marine planning context. To start with, what does a sustainability appraisal involve? There are 5 main stages. We aren't looking to change the latter stages of reporting, consultation and monitoring. So our focus is on applying a natural capital approach to the first 2, setting the context and objectives and also developing alternatives. In particular, our method covers the first 4 steps of that initial stage. So that is identifying objectives, collecting baseline information, identifying sustainability issues, and then developing the sustainability appraisal framework. We will also be bringing that foundation into the second stage of evaluating the likely effects of the different options for the marine plan, but there's still more development to do for that part of the method, so we won't be talking about that today. Moving on now to what the actual method involves. The first thing that needs to be done is to identify other relevant policies, plans and programmes. Following previous marine plan sustainability appraisals, we started with the 2009 high-level marine objectives and also the criteria of key national environmental monitoring programmes. On top of that, other relevant policies, plans and programmes also need to be considered, of which there are a lot, over 80 in fact. The MMO had already undertaken work to pull out objectives and targets from these different policies, plans and programmes, leading to more than 300 individual objectives, which we needed to condense. So we categorised the individual objectives according to key themes used within the marine planning framework. These spread across 4 main areas: economy, social, environment and governance, within which there are a range of sub-themes. But we also brought in natural capital thinking here in terms of whether the objectives related to the use of an asset, so primarily whether it related to ecosystem services, or was intended to improve the status of that asset itself. So that included objectives under GES and other conservation initiatives. We then grouped the individual objectives and created higher level overarching objectives that captured the key elements from all those individual plans, programmes and policies. And that led to a much more manageable 33 overarching objectives. Those overarching objectives spanned the economy, environment and society categories and covered things ranging from net zero, economic development and food production ambitions, climate and coastal change, healthy species and habitats, and also access, cultural heritage and wider societal benefit. These overarching objectives then provided an initial framework that highlighted some key priorities related to the marine environment and hence helped to bound the scope of the later stages of the sustainability appraisal.
Step 2 of the sustainability appraisal is to collect baseline information. And in order to bring a natural capital approach to this, we organised this information in terms of natural capital assets and services supplied by those assets. We'll go through each of the main outputs produced, covered by the different coloured boxes here in the following slides. The first part of collecting the baseline information is to identify high-level assets using a hierarchical framework. We recommended including a series of high-level assets from 6 main groups that cover the main marine habitat types, mobile and sedentary species groups, heritage assets and the major abiotic features. Existing classifications can be referred to for some of these high-level assets, such as OSPAR water bodies for shelf pelagic assets and the UK Marine Strategy and OSPAR list for mobile species. In other cases, classifications may not exist, but guidance has been given. Setting out this list of specific assets to cover in the essay under each high-level asset was seen as important because it ensures that sustainability can be appraised for all aspects of natural capital that underpin benefits from the marine plan area, rather than focusing on only those more well-known or better evidenced species or features. Next, we demonstrated how you can complete an asset register, which compiles and summarises relevant information on extent, quantity, status and trends for each of the specific assets covered in the hierarchical classification. For extent or quantity, an area or volume may be available for habitat assets in the marine plan area, and a population size or numbers per unit area for mobile and sedentary species assets and for heritage assets. Maps are not required to complete the sustainability appraisal, but can be useful for visualising the information and thinking about the evidence in a spatial way. Status and trends information is really important in understanding ongoing risk to and sustainability issues for assets, and we'll come back to this. The UK Marine Strategy Assessments are one example of where status and trends information is provided for high-level assets at the scale of the regional sea or UK as a whole. Other ongoing monitoring, such as for designated species, may also be used as a proxy for particular assets across the area. Existing assessments may not be available for status and trends at the scale of the marine plan area. So we recommend providing the best available assessment, such as that from UKMS reporting, and in a later step, regional engagement can then be used to draw in any more regional knowledge and to adjust the status and trends information on this basis.
A sustainability appraisal can't cover everything in minute detail. There needs to be a process to keep it manageable and focused on what the most significant issues are. To that end, we included as a final part of the asset register a step in the method to look at how to flag the relative importance of different assets. It might sound a bit odd for marine, but as a first step, we started with a design manual for roads and bridges. It's used a lot in environmental impact assessment, including, for example, for offshore wind, and has useful generic categorisation of importance based on factors like designations and the geographic scale at which those designated species and habitats are deemed important, their wider rarity, and also the degree to which other environmental assets can substitute for them. There are more marine-specific assessments that can be used for a more comprehensive assessment. Natural England recently commissioned a study to define irreplaceable habitats, and this work includes a more detailed scoring against key criteria that reflect what makes habitats vulnerable. 3 of those criteria were used: rarity, environmental context, so the uniqueness of a habitat in a place, and fragility, in terms of how sensitive a habitat is and how difficult it is to recover, restore, and recreate. I appreciate that the detail of this won't be clear, but the point of showing it is to illustrate how all the baseline information gathered so far for the asset register can be drawn together. I'm sure at least some of you will be trying to squint into the detail. So broadly, these first columns break down the asset hierarchy, and this one is for recording headline figures on extent or quantity as appropriate. But the part I want to highlight is this bit here, where the colour coding allows the relative status, trends and importance of the assets, as well as any data gaps, to be clearly visualised. It is, of course, supported by a much larger database with all the detail. At the moment, that database is made up of national data, as that's what we've worked with so far during method development. But the complete asset register would also include assessment of the status, trends and importance at the scale of a specific marine plan. So that's the asset side. And the next steps in the logic chain move on to ecosystem services and benefits. For a comprehensive sustainability appraisal, we need to think about the social and economic aspects as well as the ecological. And there is a standard list of topics that comes from strategic environmental assessment and has, up to now, been used to frame marine plan sustainability appraisal. The asset register begins to provide information on many of these topics, but alone it doesn't provide the full picture and it doesn't touch at all on the more people-centred topics. These gaps can be addressed, at least in part, by looking at ecosystem services and benefits. And as with the assets, the first step is to select an appropriate framework. And we use CICES, that's the Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services, given how that is developing as the standard. It has the advantages of being comprehensive with no overlaps between services, links to the system of environmental economic accounting, and has had quite a lot of field testing and stakeholder co-development. At the time we were working on the method, CICES was still in version 5.1, but we had input into the development of the new version, so it should continue to align. That then gives us a high-level framework that looks more like this and includes provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. So that's food, materials, water, energy, the support for a healthy environment and populations, including reducing hazards and regulating the climate, as well as how people interact with the environment, its cultural significance, and wider non-use values. We've also included carrier services within the provisioning category. This isn't included in CICES, but it allows for activities like shipping, subsea cables, and military activity to be brought into the framework because these are important in the wider marine plan. As for the asset register, the full framework is hierarchical, so there are more levels beyond this to make it easier to drill down into the detail. In terms of method steps, the idea is to gather available data that shows the extent to which ecosystem services are used within the marine plan area and, ideally, the value of that. This might be, for example, fish landings data, tourism statistics, or the supply of offshore wind. It's important to note that there are likely to be gaps, particularly on the value side. And also that this assessment covers both what is actually used, but also where there is the potential for use, for example, more offshore wind, to reflect where services are undersupplied and could be exploited further in future. The previous step pulls in evidence on where there is hard data on ecosystem service delivery and the value of benefits. In all likelihood, the available data will relate primarily to provisioning services, and so will not capture the full range of services provided by the assets in the area. Regulating services, for example, tend to have a lot of data gaps. So we need a mechanism to highlight which assets supply those other services. And this is where an asset service matrix comes in. It compiles documented evidence and expert judgment to give a relative categorical scale for how well a particular asset supplies a particular ecosystem service. So here, for example, you can see how plankton and invertebrates are important for diluting wastes, but mobile species come into their own for cultural services. Services provided by abiotic features only are included, so how the water, rocks and sand support sport and leisure, for example. This relative importance of the different assets in terms of their ecosystem service supply also gets built into the asset register so that it is included in the high-level summary.
A really important final stage to collecting the baseline information is to sense check this with regional stakeholders. We've proposed a workshop format that can be followed for this and based around a number of key questions that cover the main areas of evidence outlined for the baseline. For example, in terms of policy objectives, the workshop can explore questions such as, does the objective address a key local or regional issue? Does the objective deliver multiple benefits across different capitals? Does the area make a unique contribution to achieving the objective at a national scale, for example? For assets, we would look to utilise expertise on status and trends that's more specific to the marine plan area, and to explore the regional specific importance of assets, and a similar exercise in terms of ecosystem services. Having collated and sense-checked all baseline information, step 3 of the sustainability appraisal is to identify sustainability issues. We have proposed a risk matrix approach to classify the relative risks to each high-level asset covered based on the status and trends information collated in the asset register. And a second matrix that then takes this risk to assets and combines with their service supply potential to give an overall risk to supply of ecosystem services for each natural capital asset. In addition, we set out methods that can be used to identify the key activities and pressures of concern for each asset, based on their sensitivity to those anthropogenic pressures, utilising existing published approaches. We can then combine the information on risk to assets, services they supply, and activities of concern into a sustainability issues table. This slide shows one example row for such a table. It also incorporates information on policy objectives of concern due to their reliance on activities that could impact assets at risk, and a qualitative assessment related to future concerns. More detailed guidance is provided on how to complete each of the steps that underlie the columns in the sustainability issues table. Ultimately, this allows for a summary of sustainability issues for assets and services in the marine plan area, which can then be used to inform the next step. In the fourth step, the Sustainability Appraisal Framework is developed. This brings together evidence from steps 2 and 3 on assets, services and risks to these, and is combined to categorise assets. These categories allow for clear signposting of assets at greatest levels of risk, also taking account of their role in supporting ecosystem services humans depend on from the marine plan area, and the importance of those assets to conservation, national and local policy objectives. 3 categories of asset risk are highlighted. In category 1, the asset is significantly degraded and at risk, impacting the potential for the continued supply of services and benefits and for conservation and management targets to be met. In category 2, there is evidence of asset degradation, but a lower risk that conservation and management of objectives will not be met, or that the supply of services and benefits will decline. The third category, conservation and management objectives for the asset, are on target, and risks to the continued delivery of services and benefits are of least concern. In the fourth step of the sustainability appraisal, a framework is developed for appraisal of options. High-level guidelines related to likely sustainability of plan policies can be developed utilising the categorical assessment that we have just described. For example, under Guideline 1, a precautionary approach would be applied to plan policies that could impact assets in Category 1, where those assets are in Category 1 due to having an unknown status and/or trends. Whereas in Guideline 2, any marine plan policies leading to further impacts on Category 1 assets where status and/or trends are known are not sustainable and should not be included. Under Guideline 3, policies allowing activities negatively affecting Category 2 assets may be sustainable in some circumstances, but there should be consideration of the implications of this, and there would need to be additional detailed monitoring and evaluation of any policies that impact on these assets. This is a new methodology, and we have completed an interim version that covers the work described. Consultants are now beginning to start the scoping of the SA for the East Marine Plan areas in England, and as they do so, we are working with them to develop the method iteratively, focused on steps 1 and 2 for the scoping phase at the moment. We will be looking to see how far they are able to complete the different baseline information outputs, and also looking at any major evidence gaps and what that means in terms of the evidence baseline information collated. We focused on development of the natural capital underpinning in the sustainability appraisal here, but consultants will now be looking at how this method integrates with wider requirements of the SA around social and economic assessment. We will also be looking at how our provisional ideas around generating categories for sustainability issues could be applied in the assessment phase of the SA, and how guidelines linked to this could be used to help appraise options for marine plan policies, so that policies are clearly appraised in relation to the likelihood of them impacting natural capital assets at threat in the marine plan area. We have shared our methods with colleagues working in Scottish Government on marine planning, but would be very happy to discuss further with anyone attending today and to take any questions now. Thanks for listening.